The day Eli Cade hauled the first pine log into Harrow Creek with nothing but his bare hands and a mule named Duchess, every soul in that town turned their back on him. Every soul except the one who would, in time, become the reason he stayed. The year was 1874, and the Colorado Territory was no place for the soft-hearted. The mountains that ringed the valley town of Harrow Creek were ancient and indifferent, their snow-capped peaks catching the last amber fire of the September sun, while down below, in the dust and the boot-scarred mud of the main street, men carried grudges heavier than the rifles slung across their backs. Harrow Creek had been settled by hard people who trusted no one they had not known for at least a decade, and Eli Cade had arrived less than 2 weeks prior, alone, bearing nothing but a canvas pack, a worn Bible with a cracked leather spine, and a reputation that had followed him down from the high passes like smoke from a distant fire. He was not a small man. That much was impossible to ignore. Eli stood well over 6 feet, broad at the shoulder in a way that made door frames feel like an afterthought, his arms thick with the kind of muscle that came not from vanity, but from decades of labor against the mountain itself, from splitting timber in the cold, from hauling stone up frozen slopes, from wrestling the wilderness into something that could shelter a living soul. His dark hair fell past his collar in loose waves, pushed back from his forehead, and streaked at the temples with silver, though he was only 34 years old. His jaw was strong and perpetually shadowed, his eyes the color of storm-gray slate, and there was a quietness about him that some men read as peace and others read as danger. In Harrow Creek, most read it as the latter. The trouble had started the way most trouble did in that valley, with a story half told and half invented. Word had come ahead of Eli's arrival from a trapper named Gordy Fitch, who was known for 3 things: excellent pelts, terrible teeth, and a tongue that never rested. Fitch had passed through Harrow Creek 2 days before Eli arrived, and over his whiskey at the Prairie Dog Saloon, he had told anyone who would listen that the big mountain man coming down from the high country had killed a preacher up in Silverton. Not in a duel, not in defense, just killed him, over a disagreement about land. That was the story. And by the time Eli walked into Harrow Creek with Duchess plodding at his heels, it had already settled into the town like frost into clay, cold and unyielding. It did not matter that the story was wrong. It did not matter that Eli Cade had never killed anyone in his life, that the preacher in Silverton was still alive and in perfectly sound health, and that the actual disagreement had been about a boundary survey that the county had since resolved in Eli's favor. None of that mattered in Harrow Creek, because Harrow Creek had already decided. Eli had rented a plot of land at the north end of town from a widow named Mrs. Holt, who was half deaf and therefore had not heard Gordy Fitch's story in time to reconsider. She charged him $3 a month for the use of a half-acre of scrubby land that sat between the edge of the tree line and the town's only cemetery. It was not a desirable plot. The ground was rocky, the soil thin, and in the mornings a cold shadow from the mountain fell over it long before the rest of the town was dark. But Eli had looked at it with his gray eyes and nodded slowly, as if he could already see something no one else could. On his 3rd day in town, he had gone to the general store owned by Hank Dobbs to purchase a box of nails and a saw blade, and Dobbs had taken his money with 2 fingers, as if the coins themselves might be contaminated. "What are you building?" Dobbs had asked, his tone somewhere between suspicion and contempt. "A church," Eli had said. The word had landed in the store like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples had spread fast. By nightfall, half of Harrow Creek was laughing, and the other half was furious. A man who had allegedly killed a preacher building a church. The irony was not lost on anyone, and it did nothing to improve Eli's standing. If anything, it deepened the suspicion. What kind of man does something like that? What is he trying to prove? What does he want from this town? Eli Cade did not answer these questions because no one asked them to his face. Instead, the town watched from a distance, arms crossed and mouths tight, as he began clearing the rocky plot with his hands and a pickaxe, breaking up the pale Colorado soil in the sharp morning air while the aspens on the hillside began their slow golden turn toward autumn. It was on the 7th morning of his work, A Tuesday in late September with a sky so blue it looked painted that Clara Ashford first saw him. She had come to lay flowers on her mother's grave, which sat near the back of the cemetery not 20 yards from where Eli was working. Clara was 26 years old, the schoolteacher at Harrow Creek's one-room schoolhouse, and she had lived in this valley her entire life, save for 2 years she had spent in Denver, receiving her teaching certificate from a women's college there. She was not tall, but she carried herself as if she were, her dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a small hat that had seen better days, her dress the color of pine needles, sensible and worn at the hem from daily use. She had green eyes, not pale green but deep, like creek water in shade, and a mouth that was quick to press firm when she was holding back what she actually thought, which was often. Clara had heard the story about Eli Cade. She had heard 3 different versions of it, in fact, each slightly more dramatic than the last, and she had filed all 3 of them under the category she privately labeled things men say when they are frightened of something they cannot easily explain. She had learned this category from her mother, who had been a sharp, clear-thinking woman, and who now resided quietly beneath the fresh wildflowers Clara set at the base of her headstone every week without fail. She had not intended to speak to him. She had come for her mother, not for conversation. But when she straightened up from the grave and turned to walk back through the cemetery gate, she found that Eli Cade had stopped his work and was watching her with a look on his face that she had not expected. Not the cold suspicion she received from most of the town's men, nor the patronizing gentleness of those who thought she was fragile, but something honest and unguarded, something almost like recognition, as if he had seen her somewhere before, and was only now remembering where. "You come every week," he said. It was not a question. Clara stopped walking. "You have been watching?" "No," he said simply. "I saw you last Tuesday, and I see you now. That is 2 Tuesdays." She looked at him properly then, at the breadth of his shoulders beneath his flannel shirt, at the dark waves of his hair, damp at the temples from exertion, at the easy way he held the pickaxe at his side as if it weighed nothing, which, given his arms, it probably did not. She looked at his gray eyes, which were direct and unhurried, and she thought that whatever else this man was, he was not a liar. Liars had a certain quality about them, a kind of performance in the eyes, and this man's eyes held none of it. "My mother," she said, nodding back toward the grave. He looked at the headstone, and something in his expression shifted, softened in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. "I'm sorry for your loss." "She passed 2 years ago," Clara said, "but thank you." There was a moment of silence between them, the kind that is not uncomfortable but simply present, and then Clara found herself saying something she had not planned to say. "I heard what they are saying about you in town." He did not flinch. He just looked at her with those gray eyes and waited. "I do not believe it," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and even, like the sound of a river over smooth rock. "Most people do." "Most people in this town have never left it," Clara said, "which makes them very good at knowing each other and very poor at knowing strangers." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the distant ancestor of one. He looked back at the rocky ground he had been clearing, at the grid of stakes and string he had laid to mark the footprint of his intended structure. "A church," Clara said, studying the layout. "You are serious about it." "I'm always serious," he said. She studied him for another moment, then looked at the stakes, calculating dimensions with the part of her mind that was always measuring and reasoning. "That is large for one man to build alone." "It will take time," he agreed. "Do you know how to build a church?" "I have built 2 others," he said. "One in Wyoming, one in New Mexico territory. Stone foundation, timber frame, pine planking on the inside. Bell tower if the timber is right." He paused. "There is good timber up on the north face, straight pines. I will need to haul them down." Clara looked at the mountains, at the dark belt of forest that ran along the lower slopes, and then back at him. "Alone?" "Duchess helps," he said, nodding at the mule, who was standing tied to a fence post and looking profoundly unimpressed with everything. Clara almost smiled at that. She almost did, but she pulled it back, because she was not in the habit of smiling at men she had just met, and because she could already feel the weight of the town's eyes, even though no one was visibly watching. In Harrow Creek, someone was always watching. "My name is Clara Ashford," she said instead. "I teach at the schoolhouse." "Eli Cade," he said, and the name needed no introduction, which they both understood. She nodded once, turned, and walked back through the cemetery gate the way she had come. But as she crossed the main street toward the schoolhouse, she found herself thinking about the layout of those stakes, about the precision with which they had been placed, about the way a man who had done something terrible would not bother to ensure that his foundation angles were exactly square. She thought about it all through the school day. She thought about it at supper. And on Wednesday morning, when she walked past the north end of town on her way to collect water from the east pump, she paused at the fence line of his plot and watched him work for just a moment, watched the way he swung the pickaxe in long, steady arcs, the muscles of his back shifting beneath his shirt with each stroke, his dark hair loose around his jaw, his breath making clouds in the cold morning air. He did not see her that time, or if he did, he gave no sign. She walked on. The town, meanwhile, had not softened. If anything, the knowledge that Eli Cade was actually building the church, that it was not a rumor or a boast but a genuine undertaking, had made people more agitated rather than less. There was a meeting at the Prairie Dog Saloon on Thursday evening, attended by most of the town's prominent men: Hank Dobbs, the storekeeper; Warren Cross, who owned the livery stable; Leland Pruitt, who fancied himself Harrow Creek's unofficial mayor, though the town had no formal government, and several others. The meeting was nominally about the matter of the new arrival, but was in practice about the discomfort of men who had decided something and did not want to be asked to reconsider it. Leland Pruitt, a tall, thin man with the face of a disappointed bird, had been the one to call the meeting, and he stood at the end of the bar with his thumbs in his suspenders and announced that it was unseemly, a man of Cade's reputation building a church in their town. "What reputation?" asked a quiet voice from the back of the room. Several heads turned. It was Tom Ashford, Clara's younger brother, who was 19 years old and worked at the blacksmith's forge, and had the kind of blunt, honest quality that made older men either respect him or resent him, depending on their character. "The reputation that precedes him," Pruitt said, with the tone of a man who considers his own statements to be self-evident. "That reputation came from Gordy Fitch," Tom said. "And Gordy Fitch told me last spring that the Hendersons' old mare could predict snowfall, so I'm not sure Gordy Fitch is the measuring stick I want to use for a man's entire character." There was a murmur in the room, and Pruitt's face went through several interesting colors. The meeting ended without resolution, as such meetings usually do when someone sensible speaks up, but the resentment in the room did not disperse. It just went underground, where it would simmer quietly and occasionally find small ways to surface. The first way it surfaced was in the matter of the timber. Eli had arranged with a logger named Peters, who worked the north face, to cut and haul down 24 straight pines for the frame and walls of the church. Peters had shaken Eli's hand on it Monday and taken a deposit. By Friday, Peters had returned the deposit by way of a boy messenger and sent word that he was unable to fulfill the arrangement. No reason given. But the reason was not difficult to infer. Someone had spoken to Peters, and Peters, who sold his timber to 3 businesses in Harrow Creek and could not afford to be on the wrong side of men like Pruitt and Dobbs, had made a practical decision. Eli received this news with the same quiet stillness with which he received most things. He stood at the edge of his cleared plot in the early evening light, looked up at the north face of the mountain, and then looked at Duchess. The mule looked back at him with her large, liquid eyes. He had a timber axe and a 2-man saw that could be operated by 1 man if the man was willing to work half again as hard. He had rope and chains and a mule with more stubbornness than sense. He was on the mountain before dawn the next morning. Clara learned of the timber situation from her brother Tom at breakfast on Saturday, and she sat with the information through the morning, turning it over in her mind with the same methodical patience she applied to every problem. She graded her students' arithmetic papers, she swept her small house, she braided her hair twice because the first time it came out uneven, and then at noon she put on her coat and walked to the north end of town. He was not there. The plot was empty except for the stakes and the partially dug foundation trench. She looked up at the mountain, and in the middle distance, among the dark pines, She could see the tiny, distant movement of a figure, and hear, carried faintly on the wind, the rhythmic sound of an axe. She had brought a covered pot of stew. It was a practical thing, she told herself. A man working alone in the cold needed to eat, and she had made too much stew for one person, and it would go to waste otherwise. These were the reasons she gave herself, and they were true as far as they went, which was not very far. She left the pot at the foot of the cleared land, where he would see it when he came down. She weighted the lid with a stone so the wind would not take it, and she walked back home. The next morning there was a note on her porch. It said, "Thank you. E.C." The handwriting was clear and firm. She kept the note. She put it in the small wooden box on her dresser where she kept things that mattered, and she did not examine too closely why she did that. October settled over Harrow Creek like a cool hand, and the aspens blazed gold against the dark mountain slopes, and Eli Cade worked every day from before first light until after the last of it was gone. He was hauling his own timber down now, one log at a time on a makeshift sled rigged behind Duchess, and the work was brutal and slow, and he did it without complaint or fanfare, the great cords of muscle in his arms and legs straining against the weight in the mountain itself, his breath hanging white in the cold air, his jaw set with a determination that was so quiet, it was almost frightening. People watched. They could not help but watch. The sight of him was difficult to ignore. This enormous, solitary man, laboring day after day with methodical patience, building something for a town that had not asked him to and had made it abundantly clear it did not want him there. Some people watched with contempt, some with unease, and a few, a very few, with something that might, if it had been allowed to, become admiration. Clara brought stew again the following Saturday, and this time she stayed. She told herself she stayed because she had a question about the foundation. She had been reading about timber frame construction in one of her father's old engineering pamphlets, and she was curious about the joint system he was using. That was true. But she also stayed because when Eli Cade came down from the mountain in the late afternoon with timber chips in his hair and dirt on his jaw and his big hands raw from the cold, he looked at the pot she had brought and then at her with those gray eyes, and she did not want to be somewhere else. They sat on the low stone wall that ran along the back of the cemetery and ate from the pot with the 2 tin plates she had thought to bring, and they talked. Not about the town or the gossip or the story Gordy Fitch had told. None of that was invited into the space between them. They talked about the mountains, which Eli knew with the intimacy of long familiarity, and about teaching, which Clara spoke of with a passion that surprised him, and about Denver, where she had gone for 2 years and which she had loved and left, because Harrow Creek needed a teacher and her mother had needed a daughter nearby. "Do you miss it?" he asked. "Denver?" "Some things," she said. "The library, mostly, and the concerts in summer. There was a string quartet that played on Thursday evenings in a park near the college." She paused. "That sounds ridiculous." "It does not," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "You have been to concerts?" "Once," he said. "In St. Louis. I was passing through on my way west." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains, and then he said, "I thought it was the most extraordinary thing I had ever heard. All those people, all that silence that was not really silence, everyone holding their breath in the same direction." Clara felt something shift in her chest at that, at the precision and the feeling of it, at the image of this enormous, solitary, mountain-roughened man sitting in a St. Louis concert hall, holding his breath in the direction of a string quartet. She turned her face toward the mountains because she did not want him to see what was in her expression. "Why a church?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if he would answer at all. Then he said, "My mother was a woman who believed very hard in God and very little in herself. She spent most of her life in a town that had no church, which meant if she wanted to pray with other people, if she wanted the thing that comes from being with other people in that kind of quiet, she had to ride 30 miles each way." He paused. She did it every Sunday until the horse went lame. Then she just sat in the kitchen and did it by herself. Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be better than silence. "I built the first one for her," he said, "in Wyoming. She was gone by then. but I built it for her anyway." He picked up his plate and looked at the frame stakes in the ground. The second one was in New Mexico for a town of mostly Spanish-speaking settlers who had no access to a priest. I learned enough Spanish to put up the notices. A pause. "This one is the third." "And no one has asked you to build any of them," Clara said. "No," he said. "No one ever asks." She thought about that for a long time on the walk home. The weeks turned, and October deepened, and the cold sharpened its edges. The foundation went in, a ring of flat stone that Eli had quarried himself from the base of the canyon wall to the east, each stone fided dry with a patience and precision that any mason would have respected. The stonework alone had taken 3 weeks, and when it was done, it was solid and square and level in a way that surprised people who had expected something rough. Tom Ashford was the first person in town to help. He showed up one morning in late October without announcement, told Eli he had Sunday free and could swing a hammer if there was call for it, and Eli had handed him a hammer with no ceremony and no particular gratitude beyond a nod. They worked side by side for most of the day, and Tom asked the question that had been in his mind since the town meeting. "Is it true, what Fitch said?" "No," Eli said, fitting a notch into a beam. "The preacher in Silverton is alive and well, to the best of my knowledge." Tom chewed on that for a while, working the hammer. "Why don't you tell people that?" "Because they have already decided," Eli said. "A man cannot argue someone out of something they did not reason themselves into." Tom looked at him with the frank assessing gaze of a young man who is just beginning to understand how the world works, and then nodded slowly, and they went back to work. Word of Tom's assistance reached Clara through the small, efficient intelligence network that is any small town's primary industry. She heard it from the woman who ran the post office, who had seen Tom arrive and stay, and who reported it with the carefully neutral tone of someone who is not quite sure what to think of a thing. Clara received the news with the same neutral expression, finished buying her stamps, and went home feeling something warm and complicated in her chest. The first week of November brought snow, light and early, dusting the peaks and the high meadows white and sending a cold, sharp wind down through the valley that made the aspens chatter and the shutters bang. Eli had the exterior frame up by then, the pine timbers rising raw and pale against the gray sky, the skeleton of what would be a real and genuine church visible to anyone who cared to look. The town looked. Some looked with grudging acknowledgement, some with stubborn refusal to be impressed, but even Leland Pruitt, riding past in his black coat, could not help pausing for a moment to observe that the joinery was correct. He would not have said so to anyone, but he paused. Clara had begun a new habit. Every morning before school, she took the long way from her house to the schoolhouse, the way that went along the north end of town past the construction. She told herself this was because the long way had better light in the morning. This was not entirely false, but she had started timing her walks to coincide with when Eli was typically beginning his morning work, and there was a 5-minute exchange that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, a daily ritual. She would pass, he would look up, and they would talk about something. The progress of the frame, the weather on the mountain, a book she was reading that she had mentioned and that he had asked about, because he read more than anyone in Harrow Creek would have guessed and asked questions with a directness that was bracing and wonderful. He had read Darwin, which surprised her and delighted her in equal measure. He had opinions about Darwin, careful, considered ones, the kind that come from someone who has lived close enough to the natural world to have observations of his own. He had also read Dickens, which he thought was overlong, and Emerson, which he thought was almost right. He had read the complete works of one Harriet Beecher Stowe, which he had found in a trapper's cabin in Wyoming when he was 19, and which had, he said without embellishment, changed something in the way he thought about the world. "You carry all these books with you?" she asked one morning. "In here," he said, tapping his temple. "You read them once and remember them." "Most of them," he said, "the ones worth remembering." She went to school that morning thinking about what it would be like to have an entire library inside one's head, available at any altitude. The second person to help Eli was, improbably, Hank Dobbs. It happened not because Dobbs had changed his mind about Eli, but because of a transaction that was, at its core, purely practical. Eli came into the general store in mid-November to purchase window glass, 2 panes which he would need for the church's front windows, and Dobbs, still in the habit of touching Eli's money with 2 fingers, informed him that he had no glass in stock, but could order it from Denver at considerable expense and a 6-week wait. Eli said he would take that arrangement. Dobbs wrote up the order, and then, because Eli was the only other person in the store and Dobbs had been stewing privately about something for 2 weeks, the storekeeper said, without looking up from his order book, "You do good stonework." "Thank you," Eli said. Silence. "My back wall has a bad foundation," Dobbs said. "Been settling for 3 years. Nobody in this town knows a thing about stone." Eli looked at him for a moment. "I will look at it." He looked at it that afternoon and diagnosed the problem in about 4 minutes. A section of the original foundation had been laid on loose shale, which had continued to shift under the weight of the wall. He told Dobbs what needed doing. Dobbs asked how much. Eli named a fair price. They shook hands. It took Eli 2 days to fix the foundation, working in the cold with methodical care, and when it was done, Dobbs stood at the back of his store and looked at the repaired wall and said nothing for a long time. "I'm taking those extra nails off the order," he said finally. "The ones you bought in September." Eli had already paid for those nails. Dobbs was giving him a refund, which in Hank Dobbs's economy of expression was the equivalent of a public apology, a parade, and a heartfelt speech. "I appreciate that," Eli said simply. The thaw did not come all at once. It never does in places that have frozen hard, but after Dobbs and Tom Ashford, there were 1 or 2 others. Quiet, private gestures, a sack of flour left at his rented room at the Widow Holt's, a bucket of pine tar for waterproofing the roof left at the construction site with no note. Small things. Anonymous. The town moving as slowly and reluctantly as the ice on a creek in March. Clara, watching this from her particular vantage point, found it both encouraging and frustrating. She was not, by temperament, a patient woman when she believed something was right. She believed Eli Cade was right, not in some vague, sentimental sense, but specifically and concretely right about this church, about this town, about the fact that a community of people who had been thrown together by circumstance and hardship needed a dedicated space in which to be something more than just neighbors tolerating each other's presence. She began, carefully, to use her position. She was the school teacher. She was trusted, or at least respected, in the way that school teachers in small towns always are, with a slightly wary deference that comes from the fact that the teacher knows all of your children and can therefore embarrass you in ways you have not yet anticipated. She began to talk, quietly, to the mothers. She talked to Margaret Cross, whose husband Warren owned the livery, and who had 3 children in Clara's school, and who came in every Friday to hear about their progress. She talked to Delia Pruitt, Leland's wife, who was a more practical woman than her husband by some considerable margin. She talked to the widow Holt, who had already decided she liked Eli Cade on the grounds that he paid his rent on time and did not track mud into her hallway. She did not argue for Eli. She did not defend him exactly, because that would have put people's backs up. She just talked about the church, about what it would mean for the town to have one, about the fact that 6 people had died in the past 2 years without any kind of proper service because Harrow Creek had no church and no minister. She talked about Margaret Cross's youngest girl who had been sick last winter and who had spent several nights in genuine fear, and about how it would have been something, surely it would have been something, to have a place nearby to go and sit and not be alone in the fear. Margaret Cross had cried a little at that, quietly, with good composure, pressing her handkerchief to the corner of each eye in turn. The tide, which had been motionless for weeks, began at last to move. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, a delegation of 3 women, Margaret Cross, the widow Holt, and a German-born farmer's wife named Brigitte Schell, arrived at Eli's construction site with a pot of coffee, a slab of cornbread wrapped in cloth, and the information that Margaret's husband Warren would be sending 2 of his stable boys over on Saturday to help with the roof planking. Eli stood in the cold and received this information and this cornbread with the same quiet, undemonstrative manner with which he received everything. And the three women stood there for a moment, uncertain whether they had made an impression at all. And then the widow Holt said, "Well, are you going to thank us or not, young man?" And Eli's expression broke open into a full, real smile, wide and genuine and startling, the way lightning is startling, because you did not know quite how bright it would be until it happened. All three women walked home in better spirits than they had arrived in. Clara heard about the smile from Mrs. Holt that evening, delivered with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who has confirmed a suspicion, and she lay in her bed that night thinking about it, thinking about what his face must look like when it did that, open and bright and wholly unguarded. And she felt something she had not felt in a long time, something she did not name because naming it felt dangerous, and also because she already knew what it was and there was no practical reason to say it out loud to herself. December came in hard and fast, the way Colorado Decembers do, with a storm that dropped 2 feet of snow on the valley in 3 days and closed the mountain passes and kept everyone indoors by their fires. The church frame stood in the snow with its raw, pale timbers and its half-finished roof, patient as the mountain itself. Eli worked through it anyway, not on the heavy structural work that required space and leverage that the snow made impractical, but on the interior work, the fitting and the finish, the things that could be done in a sheltered space. He had built a makeshift shelter over part of the frame and worked inside it by lantern light. And on the 3rd day of the storm, when the snow was still falling thick and soft and the wind had dropped to an occasional sigh, he looked up from his work on a window frame, fitting to find Clara Ashford climbing over the fence with a lantern of her own and a determined expression on her face. She had brought soup. She had also brought a copy of a construction manual from her father's library that she had found the previous evening, which dealt specifically with the structural considerations for cold climate buildings, and which she had bookmarked with strips of paper at 3 sections she thought might be relevant. "The school is closed because of the snow," she said by way of explanation, setting down the soup. "Yes," he said. "I thought I could be useful." He looked at her for a moment, at the snowflakes melting on her hair, at the earnest, slightly defiant set of her jaw, at the bookmarked manual under her arm, and something in his expression did what it had done in Mrs. Holt's description. It opened, just at the corners, into something warm and real. "Can you hold a piece level while someone marks it?" he asked. "I imagine I can manage that," she said. She held pieces level while he marked them, and she held them steady while he planed them, and she read aloud from the relevant sections of the construction manual with a clear, precise voice while he fitted joints, and they worked together in the dim lantern light of the half-finished church while the snow fell outside and the storm hushed the world to a murmur, and it was the best afternoon Eli Cade had spent in longer than he could clearly remember. At some point, Clara could not have said exactly when, they had stopped talking about construction. They were talking about her father, who had been an engineer on the early railroad lines and who had left behind a small library of technical manuals and surveying books when he died, and about Eli's own father, who had been a trapper and who had taught Eli to read using a Bible and a primer because there was no school within 200 miles. They were talking about what it felt like to be alone in the mountains, which Eli described with a specificity and an odd tenderness that she found quietly breathtaking. The particular quality of silence above the tree line, the way the light changed at altitude, the way solitude up there was a different thing entirely from the loneliness she had sometimes felt in a town full of people she had known her whole life. "Is that why you come down?" she asked. "Because of the loneliness?" "Partly," he said, fitting a board into its place with the heel of his hand, "and partly because things need building. The churches, among other things." She watched him drive a nail with 3 clean strokes, a motion so practiced and economical it was nearly elegant. "Where will you go after this one is finished?" He looked up from the nail. His gray eyes held hers for a moment longer than was strictly conversational, and she felt the question hang in the cold air between them with a weight she had not quite expected. "I have not decided," he said. She told herself the warmth she felt at that was from the lantern. The storm broke at the end of the 3rd day, and Harrow Creek emerged into a world made white and still and luminous, the mountains shining against a sky of pure cold blue. And on that first morning after the storm, something happened in town that no one had quite predicted. People talked about the church. not with the skepticism and hostility of before, but with the ordinary practical interest of people beginning to imagine a thing as real. Margaret Cross stopped Leland Pruitt in the street and asked him whether a minister might be approached from Durango, and Pruitt, who had been wrong about something and was slowly working toward a way of not having to fully acknowledge this, said that he supposed an inquiry could be sent. Warren Cross, who had sent his stable boys to help with the roof and had since come himself to see the work, mentioned at supper that the joinery on the window frames was as good as anything he had seen in Denver. And Gordy Fitch, who had ridden back into town on the morning after the storm with fresh pelts and his terrible teeth and his relentless tongue, had started his story about the preacher in Silverton in the Prairie Dog Saloon and had found himself for the first time interrupted. That story is wrong, Tom Ashford said from the same spot at the back of the room he had occupied at the first meeting. I looked into it. The preacher in Silverton is named Davis, and he is in perfectly good health. I wrote to the county clerk's office in September and got a reply last week. The land survey dispute was settled in Cade's favor. There was no killing. The silence in the saloon had a specific quality, the quality of something being revised in real time by a group of people who had not been expecting to have to do any revising. Gordy Fitch sputtered. He said he had heard it from a reliable source. Tom Ashford asked him who. Fitch could not produce a name because the actual source was someone who had heard it from someone else who had seen Eli Cade in an argument in Silverton and had filled in the dramatic details himself, which is the way these things always work. The saloon went quiet in a different way after that. Leland Pruitt left his drink on the bar and walked out into the snow, and he stood in the cold street for a long moment looking at the pale timber frame of the church at the north end of town, and he stood there long enough that his fingers went cold in his gloves. Then he walked home and told Delia Pruitt that he was going to make a visit to Mr. Cade in the morning. He did. He went in the early morning before the rest of the town was fully awake, and he stood at the edge of the construction site in his black coat with his hat in his hands, and he told Eli Cade in a stiff and uncomfortable speech that he believed he had been in error and that he was sorry for it. He did not say that he had led a town meeting aimed at ostracizing him. He did not say that he had pressured Peters the logger to withdraw his services. He did not say a great many specific things, because Leland Pruitt was a man of significant pride and limited range when it came to actual apology. But he said he had been in error and was sorry, and given what it cost him, it was not nothing. Eli received this with the same quiet composure he received everything and said, I appreciate that. And then, because he was who he was, he said, I could use a hand mixing mortar for the chimney base if you have time. Pruitt stood there for a moment, absolutely uncertain whether this was a kindness or an insult, and then, slowly, set down his hat and rolled up his sleeves. Clara heard the story from the widow Holt before noon. She sat down at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands, not because she was sad, but because sometimes you receive information that makes you feel so much so quickly that you need a moment to organize yourself. She sat there for a moment, and then she straightened up and washed the breakfast dishes and thought about what she was going to say when she saw him next. She went to the construction site that evening, alone, in the cold December dusk with the mountains already shadowed and the first stars appearing over the eastern ridge. He was working by lantern light on the interior window frames again, and she could see the light of it warm and golden through the gaps in the board walls as she approached, and for a moment she stopped and simply looked at it, that small golden light, that warm refuge in the cold dark, and something inside her understood, quietly and completely, why he had built the first one for a mother who was already gone. She went in. He was fitting the last of the window frame on the east wall, his big hands careful and precise on the wood, his dark hair falling forward around his jaw. He looked up when she entered, and neither of them spoke for a moment. There was something in the air of the half-finished church that was different from the ordinary cold air outside, something warmer, not just from the lantern, but from the quality of the space itself, from the careful way it had been made. Pruitt came to see you, she said. He did. And you put him to work. The corner of his mouth moved. He mixed the mortar wrong 3 times. The man has never done a day of physical labor in his life. Did you tell him so? I showed him the correct way. Eli said. "Twice." "Did it take?" "On the third attempt," he said. "He worked hard when he figured out how." Clara stood in the middle of the unfinished floor and looked up through the open roof frame at the stars, at the deep, clear Colorado sky between the timbers, and then looked back at him. "Why are you doing this for people who were cruel to you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, setting down his plane, turning to face her with his arms at his sides and his gray eyes direct and serious. "Because they need it," he said. "Whether they deserve it is a different question, and one I am not the right person to be answering." She felt the words move through her like a current, and she thought she understood then, fully and finally, who this man was. Not a saint, she was not sentimental enough for that, and he was too real and too physical and too present for any abstractions to stick to him, but something rarer. A man who had decided what he was going to do with his strength and his stubbornness and his solitude, and who had made that decision not out of pride or performance, but out of something genuine and unchangeable at the center of him. She took a step toward him before she fully decided to. "Clara," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice was different from the way anyone else had ever said it, lower, more deliberate, as if it meant something specific. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like you to know that I am glad you came here." He looked at her for a long moment. There was no performance in his face, no strategy, just the gray eyes, honest and direct, and something in them that she had been feeling gathering for weeks, like clouds before a storm, building and waiting. "I think," he said quietly, "that I would like you to know the same thing." She was close enough now that she could see the timber chips caught in his dark hair, could feel the warmth that radiated from him even in the cold, and she thought with perfect clarity that she had never in her life stood this close to someone who felt so entirely, completely real. He raised one big hand and touched her jaw, so gently it was barely a touch at all, and looked at her with a question in his eyes that she answered by closing the remaining inches between them. The kiss was quiet and warm and sure, the way a foundation stone is sure, not tentative, not performing, just true. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the timber frame of the unfinished church stood pale against the dark sky, and Duchess the mule stood at her post by the fence with profound equanimity, and the town of Harrow Creek was quiet and sleeping, and entirely unaware that something had just shifted in the space between two people who had found each other in the unlikely intersection of a cemetery and a building site in the middle of a Colorado winter. Clara walked home an hour later with her cheeks cold from the air and warm from something else entirely, and she stood on her porch for a moment looking at the stars before she went inside, and she thought, of course it was him. The winter deepened, and so did everything else. January in the Colorado Territory was a serious month. It did not play at being cold. It committed to it completely, driving the temperature down until the creek froze solid and the horses wore their heaviest blankets, and the mornings were dark and crackling and still. The people of Harrow Creek moved through it with the economical purposefulness of people who have done this many times, banking their fires at night and rising to stir them before dawn, wearing their warmest wool and their most practical expressions. Eli worked through it in his methodical way, layering the exterior walls against the cold, fitting the interior boards, building the chimney from the stone base up with a care that would have satisfied any brick mason in any city. Clara came on weekends and on some evenings during the week, and between them they had established a domestic rhythm that was easy and unhurried, moving around each other in the confined space of the construction with the comfortable efficiency of two people who have stopped having to think carefully about where the other one is. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was made of those mornings on the way to school, of shared suppers on Saturday evenings at Clara's small house, of conversations that ranged from the deeply practical to the deeply philosophical and never felt like anything but necessary, of the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a task and look at her with those gray eyes and say nothing, and the nothing he said was somehow more eloquent than most people's full speeches. He told her about his life in pieces, the way a man who has lived mostly alone does, not in one comprehensive explanation, but in small installments offered at particular moments. He had grown up in the Montana Territory, the son of a trapper who died when Eli was 15, after which he had gone west and further west, always into the larger wilderness, spending his winters in mountain camps and his summers in the foothills, and occasionally in towns, where he worked as a carpenter and a stone mason, and occasionally as a scout for survey parties, and where he built the churches, which were the one true through line of his adult life. "Do you have any family left?" she asked him one evening in mid-January, sitting across from him at her kitchen table while a pot of beans bubbled on the stove. "A sister," he said. "In Billings. Married with 3 children. I write to her." "Does she know about the church?" "I write to her about the churches," he said. "She writes back to tell me to find a place to stay." Clara smiled at that, at the sisterly pragmatism of it, at the image of Eli receiving practical feminine advice from a distance and taking it seriously while not quite following it. "She would like you," he said, looking at Clara with an expression that was simple and frank and entirely clear about what it meant. Clara looked down at her beans. Her heart was doing something rather complicated. "You think so?" "She would say exactly what she thinks of everything," he said, "which I understand you also do." She looked up. He was watching her with the quietest smile, the one that lived in his eyes more than his mouth, and she felt it land somewhere warm and permanent in her chest. "Eli," she said. "Yes?" "When the church is finished," she said carefully, "what are you going to do?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet when a question mattered, not evasively, but the way someone is quiet when they want to give a true answer rather than an easy one. "That depends," he said, "on a conversation I have not yet had the courage to have." She looked at him across the table, the winter light steady between them, and she thought, there it is. The thing that has been sitting in the room with them for weeks, real and patient, waiting. "Have it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set down his coffee cup and said, clearly and directly, without ornament, "I would like to stay here, in Harrow Creek, if you would want that." The simplicity of it was extraordinary. 4 years of growing up in a house full of people who never said exactly what they meant. 2 years in Denver learning the careful social language of educated people who say everything except the central thing. And here was this man who could have filled the whole speech with reservations and conditions and hesitations, who had every right to be cautious given what this town had put him through, and he had simply said it. "I would like to stay here." "Yes," she said, "I would want that." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat there for a moment in the warm kitchen with the beans bubbling and the winter pressing against the windows, and it was one of the most complete moments either of them had ever experienced. February came with a week of hard weather, followed by 3 days of false spring that teased the valley with warmth and snowmelt before retreating back to cold, which was what February always did in Colorado, and which everyone knew better than to trust, but always fell for anyway. The church was nearly finished by then. The exterior was complete, the roof properly sealed with pine tar and split cedar shingles, the windows in, the glass having arrived from Denver slightly early, in a development that Hank Dobbs accepted with visible relief, the chimney drawing well and tested with a small warming fire. Inside, the walls were smooth-planed pine, pale and clean, and the floor was fitted boards cut from the straightest of the logs Eli had hauled down from the north face, and at the front was a plain altar table that Eli had made from a single wide plank of mountain pine, sanded smooth and oiled until it glowed like honey in the light. Tom Ashford had made the pews, 6 of them, rough and plain but solid, after Eli showed him the joinery. Tom had spent 3 weekends on them and had done good work, and he was quietly proud of it in the way that young men are when they do something well for the first time, and find it has changed them slightly. Word had been sent to Durango about a minister, and a reply had been received from a Reverend James Whitmore, who was willing to make a regular circuit through Harrow Creek once a month, and more frequently if needed. On the last Sunday of February, a clear day with a sky that was winter blue and enormous above the white peaks, Eli drove the last nail into the final board of the interior and stood in the completed church for a long moment, alone in the early morning before anyone else was awake. He stood in the center of the nave and looked at the work from beginning to end, at the stone foundation and the fitted floor and the smooth walls and the windows catching the winter light and scattering it in long, clean bars across the pale wood. And he thought of his mother in a kitchen in Montana, praying alone. He had been working on this church for 5 months. He had worked through hostility and cold and abandonment and bad weather, and he had worked through something else too. Through the slow, extraordinary experience of being found by someone, of having a person who had chosen him clearly and deliberately and without the expectation of any return, who had walked into his construction site with soup and a bookmarked engineering manual, and who had held boards level and read aloud from technical pamphlets and kissed him in the cold December air as if it were the most natural thing in the world, who said exactly what she thought and loved without reservation, and brought him into the ordinary warm life of a small town in a way that he had never, in 34 years of mountains and solitude, known before. He had told himself, for much of his adult life, that the solitude was enough. The work was enough. The mountains were enough. He had half believed it, in the way that people half believe things they have decided to believe. He did not half believe it anymore. He went to Clara's house at first light and knocked on her door, and she opened it in her dressing gown, with her hair unbraided and her green eyes soft with sleep, and he stood on her porch in the February cold and said, "It is done." She looked at him for a moment, and then her face changed, opened up with something quiet and enormous, something that was not quite happiness because happiness was too simple a word, something more specific to this man in this place in this particular February morning. "Come in," she said. "I will make coffee." She made coffee, and he sat at her kitchen table for the 100th time, and they drank it in the early light while the town around them slowly woke, and neither of them needed to say much because the morning said it well enough. The opening of the church fell on a Sunday in early March, and it arrived not with the formal ceremony it might have received in a larger town, but with something better, with the particular, unorchestrated, slightly awkward beauty of a community coming to something for the first time, not quite sure of the proper behavior and therefore simply being human about it. They came, which was the first astonishment. They came in their good clothes, the women in their dark winter wool, and the men in their cleanest shirts. And they came, not reluctantly, but genuinely, filing through the door of the church that Eli Cade had built for them without being asked. And they found a space that was simple and clean and real, not grand, not decorated with anything except the quality of the work itself, but full of light from the glass windows and warm from the chimney and smelling of fresh pine and the faint sweetness of the oil on the altar table. Reverend Whitmore had ridden up from Durango for the occasion, a compact, white-haired man with an excellent speaking voice and the practical, no-nonsense theology of someone who serves frontier communities and has learned to keep it clear and direct. He stood at the plain altar and spoke for 30 minutes about what it means to build something in a hard place, and every person in the room knew, without it being said, that the sermon was not an abstraction. Clara sat in the second pew. She had arrived first, minutes before anyone else, when the church was still cold and the morning light was just beginning to find the windows. She had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at what he had made, at the careful light and the smooth floor and the 6 solid pews, and she had felt something that was not religious exactly, but adjacent to it, the feeling of being in the presence of something that was wholly true. She had taken a seat in the second pew and waited, and the people had come in around her, and Reverend Whitmore had spoken, and through it all she had been aware of Eli standing at the back of the church, his broad shoulders against the back wall, his arms at his sides, watching his church receive its first congregation with an expression she could see even from the second pew, quiet, complete, utterly without pride, and utterly without regret. After the service, as people filed out into the bright March morning, some stopping to speak to Reverend Whitmore, and some standing in small groups in the cold sunshine with the helpless sociability of people who have been warmed together and are not quite ready to return to the cold separately, Clara stayed in her pew. She sat until the church was nearly empty, and then she stayed a little longer, until it was. She heard him come up the aisle. His footsteps were deliberate on the pine floor, unhurried, each one placed with the same care he placed everything. He sat down beside her in the second pew, the enormous, broad-shouldered mountain man who had built this thing, folding himself into the plain pine bench with his big hands clasped loosely in his lap, and they sat together in the empty church while the winter light moved slowly through the windows and the voices of the departing congregation faded gradually into the cold morning air outside. "Last to leave," he said. "First in," she said. He turned and looked at her with those gray eyes, and she turned and looked at him, and they were very close in the quiet of the church he had built, and the light was very clear. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know," she said. "You cannot know," he said, "because I have not said it yet." "Then say it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman who said what she meant and meant what she said, who had been the first through his door and the last to leave it, who had brought him soup and bookmarked engineering pamphlets and held his boards level and kissed him in December and sat in his empty church alone with the same rightness with which she did everything. "Clara Ashford," he said, "I'm asking you to marry me." The words were plain and direct, the way everything about him was plain and direct, with no flourish and no decoration, just the thing itself, honest and sure. She looked at him, and she thought about the morning she had first seen him, the pickaxe, the stakes in the rocky ground, the gray eyes watching her across the cemetery with something that had looked like recognition. She thought about all the Tuesday mornings since then, and all the soups and the evenings and the conversations and the cold and the work and the warmth, and the way that none of it had ever felt like anything but necessary. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He laughed at that, a real, full laugh, the kind that surprised him, the kind that came from a place of genuine and unguarded joy, and the sound of it in the quiet pine church was one of the best sounds either of them had ever heard. They were married in April, in the church he had built, on a morning when the aspens on the hillside were just beginning their first green, the valley floor showing color after the long gray winter. Reverend Whitmore had come up from Durango on his circuit, and the church was full, genuinely, entirely full, people standing at the back and the sides because the pews did not hold everyone who came, which was something no one had quite anticipated and which required some creative arrangement of standing space. Tom Ashford stood at the front beside his sister, broad-shouldered and square-jawed and young, his work-roughened hands clasped in front of him, wearing a look of complicated pride that was the look of a young man who understands what he is witnessing and knows it is important. The widow Holt sat in the front pew and wept into a good handkerchief with the cheerful abandon of a woman who has earned the right to cry at things that make her happy. Hank Dobbs stood in the back with his hat in his hands and said nothing at all, which for Dobbs was a considerable emotional display. Leland Pruitt stood with his wife Delia, and he watched Eli Cade, who stood at the front of the church in his cleanest shirt with his dark hair brushed back from his jaw, and his gray eyes fixed on the door with an expression so open and unguarded that Pruitt felt, with a small private shudder, the full weight of how wrong he had been, not just wrong about the story, but wrong about the man, wrong about what the church would be, wrong about what it would mean. He did not say so to anyone, but he felt it fully, which was perhaps the more important thing. And Clara came through the door, in a dress of cream-colored wool that Margaret Cross had altered for her, her dark auburn hair pinned up with the ivory combs that had been her mother's, her green eyes finding Eli at the front of the church with the same clear directness with which she had found everything since she had first stood at the edge of his construction site and decided, quietly and without fuss, that she knew what kind of man he was. She walked up the aisle on her brother's arm, through the warmth and the light of the church she had been the first to enter, and when she reached the front, when she stood beside Eli and looked up at him and saw what was in his face, all of it, the strength and the quietness and the love that had been there since December, and probably earlier, since a Tuesday morning in September by a cemetery gate, she felt the entirety of her life up to that moment align itself into something that made sense, the way a surveyor's line makes sense when every point is true. Reverend Whitmore said the words, they said theirs. The church was very quiet and very full of light. When he kissed her, the widow Holt's composure gave out entirely, and she abandoned the handkerchief and simply wept, and several other women followed her example, and the men stood with their hats over their hearts and their faces full of the complex, unexpressible thing that men feel when they witness something true. And when they walked out into the April morning, into the bright, cool air with the mountains around them and the valley full of new green and the whole wide Colorado sky above. Clara took Eli's arm, and he put his hand over hers on his arm with the particular, careful tenderness of a man who knows the value of what he is holding. And they stood there together for a moment while the town came out around them, blinking in the light. Life in Harrow Creek after the wedding settled into a shape that was fuller and warmer than either of them had known before, which was the exact specific kind of magic that marriage can be when both people come to it honestly. They lived in Clara's house first, which was larger and more established than Eli's rented room at the Widow Holt's, and which they expanded that first summer by means of Eli building a proper back room and a covered porch with his own hands. The expansion took the better part of June and July, and it was done with the same meticulous care he brought to everything, and when it was finished, the house was solid and well lit and comfortable in a way that the town noticed and admired, because by now Harrow Creek had adopted an attitude of comfortable pride in Eli Cade's workmanship, as if it had been their idea all along. He continued to do carpentry and stonework for people in town, and he was good at it, and reliable and fair in his prices, and he had by now the kind of steady, quiet reputation that a man builds not through talking about himself, but through the accumulated evidence of what he does. Peters the logger, who had broken the timber arrangement the previous fall under pressure, came to Eli in June and offered him a standing arrangement for future timber needs, and Eli accepted it without comment and without coldness, which was perhaps the most impressive thing he had done in a town that had given him considerable opportunity to be impressive. Warren Cross asked him in August if he would take a look at the livery stable's back wall, which had a structural problem similar to the one in Dobbs's store. Eli took a look, diagnosed it, and fixed it. When Cross offered what was a somewhat low price, Eli said the price was fair enough, and Cross, reading the implication correctly, said he had been meaning to apologize for not having been more welcoming when Eli first came to town, and Eli said he appreciated that, and they shook hands, and the matter was closed. Clara taught through that fall and winter and the following spring with the same dedication she had always brought to it, and she added to her lessons things she had not previously taught, more science, informed by the conversations with Eli that had been her ongoing education in the natural world, more geography, because she now had a husband who had been to Montana and Wyoming and New Mexico Territory and Missouri and Kansas, and who could describe a landscape with a specificity that made it live in a way that no textbook could, more practical mathematics, because she had spent a winter doing construction measurements and understood in her body, not just her mind, what numbers meant in the physical world. Her students loved her. They had always loved her, but there was something new in the classroom that fall that the children felt without being able to name, a quality of settled happiness in their teacher that made the whole room feel safer, warmer, more certain. Children are extraordinarily sensitive to that kind of thing. In November, a year and a half after the church had opened and 7 months after the wedding, Clara told Eli that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Thursday evening while they were doing the washing up, which was not a particularly romantic setting, but she had learned that some news should be delivered simply and in the ordinary context of an ordinary life, because that was what it was, ordinary and extraordinary at once. He turned from the wash basin and looked at her, and his face did the thing it sometimes did, the full open thing, the wide and genuine thing, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her in his arms with a gentleness that was always slightly astonishing in a man his size, his big arms wrapped carefully around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. "A child," he said. "In the spring," she said. "April, likely." He was quiet for a moment, his arms around her in the warm kitchen. Then he said, "My mother would have loved this." She pressed her face against his chest and felt the truth of that, the line of it, the way it ran from his mother praying alone in a Montana kitchen to a church in Harrow Creek, to this kitchen, to the spring, to the April that was already assembling itself in the future. She would, Clara said. "I am sure of it." The winter was their second together, and it was both familiar and new in the way that second winters are when you have chosen your life deliberately and well. They knew the rhythms of the cold now, the way to bank the fire, and the way the house settled and contracted in the extreme cold, the way Duchess, who now lived in a proper small paddock beside the house, which Eli had built her the previous summer, communicated her opinions about the temperature through a series of sounds that were somewhere between a snort and a sigh. Clara was large with the pregnancy by February, which slowed her somewhat but did not diminish her, and she continued to teach until the middle of March, when the effort of standing for hours at a time became impractical, at which point she arranged for a temporary teacher from the next valley over and retired to the house with her books and her knitting, and Eli, who arranged his carpentry work to keep him close to home during those last weeks with a casualness that fooled nobody. The baby was born on the 2nd of April, 1876, on a morning of warm spring rain, with Brigitte Schell attending, who had 6 children of her own and was the closest thing Harrow Creek had to a midwife. He was a boy, solid and loud, with dark hair like his father's, and green eyes that would later deepen into something between gray and green. And Eli held him for the first time with the same careful, astonished tenderness with which he held everything that mattered, his enormous hands impossibly gentle, his face completely open. "Samuel," Clara said, watching him hold their son, "for your grandfather." Eli looked at her. He had told her once, only once, that his grandfather's name had been Samuel, a trapper who had come west before there was anything west to come to, and who had been the first in the family to read, and who had taught Eli's father, who had taught Eli. She had remembered it. "Samuel," he said, and the name in his voice was everything. The town, which had by now fully revised its opinion of Eli Cade in the way that communities do, loudly, as if the revision had been their idea all along, received the news of the birth with the warm, proprietary pleasure of people who consider themselves personally invested in a couple's happiness. The widow Holt arrived at the door the following morning with a wool blanket she had knitted herself, blue and white, which was the finest work of her hands, and which she offered with the brusque emotion of a woman who has decided to feel things and is not going to be embarrassed about it. Margaret Cross brought a ham. Brigitte Schell brought bread, and the flat certainty of a woman who has done this 6 times and knows exactly what new parents need, which is food and silence in equal measure. Tom Ashford came in the evening, after the others had gone, and he held his nephew for a while with the careful uncertainty of a young man who has not held many babies. And he looked at his sister across the room with an expression that was not the complicated pride of the wedding day, but something simpler, just gratitude, plain and full. "He looks like Eli," Tom said. "He does," Clara said, watching her husband asleep in the chair by the fire with the baby on his chest, both of them entirely at peace. "Good," Tom said. Samuel grew quickly, his babies due in their first year, and the house expanded again. Eli built a proper nursery off the back room, careful and precise, with a window that caught the morning light. Clara returned to teaching in September, bringing Samuel to school with her for the first half year in a manner that proved, as she had expected, to be excellent educational material for her older students and deeply entertaining for the younger ones, who considered the baby a personal acquisition. Harrow Creek itself was changing, gradually, in the way that the Colorado Territory was changing, growing, drawing new settlers, acquiring a telegraph line in 1877 and a proper post office the following year. New families arrived, and each of them attended the church on their first Sunday in town, which had become a kind of ritual welcome, and the church that had once been the subject of the town's hostility was now, without anyone quite acknowledging the irony, one of the things Harrow Creek was proud of. Reverend Whitmore continued his monthly circuit, and in the 3rd year he was joined by a younger minister named Calloway, who took up permanent residence in the valley and for whom Eli built a small house at the east end of town, which was the first building commission Eli had received without having to provide it to himself, and which he built with the same quiet care he brought to everything. Gordy Fitch, who continued to pass through Harrow Creek twice a year with his pelts and his terrible teeth and his relentless tongue, had the experience, on his first visit after the wedding, of being received by a town that had thoroughly revised its opinion and that greeted him, when he began the story of the preacher in Silverton, with the particular cold patience of people who have been fooled before and are not inclined to be so again. Fitch, to his credit, accepted this correction with better grace than might have been expected, bought several rounds of whiskey in what appeared to be a gesture of general apology, and thereafter confined his storytelling to topics about which he had reliable first-hand knowledge, which proved to be a significantly shorter list. Leland Pruitt had a conversation with Eli that spring that was, in many ways, the real completion of the apology he had not quite managed to give the previous December. He came to the house one evening after supper and sat at the kitchen table and said things he had been holding for over a year, said that he had been wrong and that he knew why he had been wrong, which was that he had been afraid of something that challenged the order of things as he understood them, and that a man of genuine conviction was always uncomfortable for men who had only opinions. He said it with difficulty, the way the truth is sometimes difficult when you are used to a different kind of fluency, but he said it completely. Eli poured him a whiskey and said, "The chimney mortar you mixed in December held well through the winter, as it happens." Pruitt looked at him for a moment, and then, improbably, he laughed, a real laugh, quiet and rueful and honest, and they drank their whiskey together with the straightforward ease of men who have gotten something correctly settled. The spring of 1878 brought Clara's second pregnancy, and with it a particular quality of settled happiness that was different from the first, fuller perhaps and more spacious, because they knew better now what they were doing, both in the general sense and in the specific sense of this house and this life and this valley that had become entirely theirs. Samuel was 2 years old by the time the new baby arrived, a boy again, born in late October into the golden light of Colorado autumn, with Clara's green eyes and Eli's dark hair and a voice that announced itself at birth with considerable authority. They named him Robert, for no particular ancestor, but because it was a name that fit him from the first moment, solid and clear. Samuel regarded his brother with the philosophical detachment of a 2-year-old encountering a new piece of furniture, uncertain of its purpose, but willing to observe it with interest. Eli, who had spent his entire adult life building things for other people in places he would eventually leave, found himself in the strange and specific grace of a life that was entirely his own. He found this neither unsettling nor constraining, as he had sometimes imagined it might be. He found it like the feeling of a well-fitted joint, the rightness of two things that have found their proper relation, holding each other steady against every kind of weather. He sat on the covered porch he had built on a November evening in 1878, with Robert asleep in the crook of one arm and Samuel leaning against his side with the drowsy weight of a small boy near the end of a long day, and Clara sitting beside him with her own coffee and a book she was not quite reading, and he looked out at the dark mountain shapes against the evening sky, those old, indifferent, magnificent mountains that had given him timber and stone and solitude and eventually this, and he felt the kind of peace that is not absence but presence. "Eli," Clara said, not looking up from the book she was not reading. "Yes." "Do you ever miss the mountains? The high ones? The real solitude?" He thought about this with the care he gave to things that deserved care. Samuel breathed deeply against his side. The baby stirred briefly and went still. "I go up in the summers," he said, 2-3 days at a time. "I know," she said, "but before, the months at a time, the whole winters." "Sometimes," he said honestly, "in the way you miss something that was a version of yourself. Not because it was better, just because it was real." She looked at him then, with those deep green eyes, and said, "This is also real." "Yes," he said, "this is also real." She put her head on his shoulder, carefully, so as not to disturb the sleeping baby, and he bent his head slightly toward hers, and they sat like that on the porch in the November evening, while the mountains held the dark, and the house held the light, and the children slept with the absolute, uncomplicated trust of small people who have never known anything but safety. The years built on themselves with the comfortable accumulation of a well-made thing. Samuel went to his mother's school and proved to be clever with numbers and words in equal measure, and to have his father's gift for reading things once and holding them. Robert was more physical, more immediate, more likely to be found at the construction site or the paddock than at the kitchen table, and he had Eli's hands, broad, dexterous, sure, and Clara's quick smile. He followed Eli everywhere from the time he could walk, and Eli received this with the same quiet, unhurried patience with which he received everything, teaching the boy to hold a hammer and set a nail with the same care with which he had once taught Tom Ashford, which is to say, showing the correct way twice, accepting imperfect results with equanimity, and trusting the work itself to be the best teacher. Tom Ashford had married in 1879 a young woman named Helen from a family that had come over the pass from New Mexico, and they had a son and then a daughter in quick succession, and Tom had set up his own smithing shop and was building a good reputation for reliable ironwork. He came to Sunday services at the church every week without fail, and he sat in the pew he had built himself with a quiet pride that age had only deepened. Clara received a letter in the summer of 1880 from Eli's sister in Billings. Eleanor, who was exactly as Clara had imagined her, sharp and direct in her writing and clearly accustomed to saying what she thought. Eleanor wrote that she had heard from Eli that Clara was a schoolteacher who had helped him build the church, and she wrote that she was glad to hear it because she had been telling her brother to find somewhere worth staying since he was 20 years old, and she was gratified that the wilderness had finally produced something that met her specifications. She would be coming through Colorado in the fall with her husband and their children, and would Eli and Clara receive them for a week. They received them for 2 weeks, because Eleanor was excellent company, and her children and Samuel and Robert immediately formed a unit that occupied itself with sustained enterprise from dawn to dusk. And because Eleanor sat at Clara's kitchen table in the evenings and talked with a frank, intelligent energy that Clara had not known she was hungry for until it arrived, the two women recognized each other immediately and completely, the way women of a particular quality do, and by the third day it was as if they had known each other for years. Eleanor, sitting with Clara on the last evening of the visit, while the men and children were in the yard and the kitchen was full of the pleasant aftermath of a large supper, looked at her sister-in-law with eyes that were lighter than Eli's, but equally direct. "He is happy," she said, as a simple statement of observed fact. "I have not seen him like this. Ever." "He has always been this way," Clara said, meaning it as a partial correction. "No," Eleanor said, with the certainty of a sister who knows. "He has always been good. He has always been capable. He has always been who he is. But happy is different." She paused, looking at her coffee cup. "Happy is because of you." Clara did not say anything for a moment, because the fullness of what she felt did not fit easily into words. Then she said, "He is happy because of himself. The happiness was already in him. I just gave it a place to stay." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment, and then said, "You're very good, Clara." "I know what I have," Clara said simply. Outside, they could hear Eli's voice, deep and easy, telling the children something about the mountain, about a trail, a view, something specific and vivid in the way he always described things he had seen with his own eyes. They could hear the children's voices rising around his, eager and attentive, and Samuel's voice above the others, asking the exact, precise question that went to the heart of the thing, which was so entirely his mother's child that Eleanor shook her head and smiled. "Lord," Eleanor said, "that boy is going to be something." "He is already something," Clara said. She was right. The church held its first proper Christmas service in December of that year, with Reverend Calloway presiding, and the pine interior lit by 24 candles that threw warm gold light onto the smooth walls and the good pews and the plain altar table that had been polished by 2 years of hands and would be polished by many more. Every person in Harrow Creek was there, and some from the outlying farms and homesteads as well, people who had come through the cold specifically for this. The church was warm from the chimney and from the gathered bodies of the people in it, and outside the snow fell in large, soft flakes that piled up on the window ledges and turned the mountains into soft, pale shapes against the dark sky. Clara sat in the second pew. She always sat in the second pew, with Robert on her lap and Samuel beside her, and Eli at the end of the row, and she looked at the candlelight on the pine walls and thought of September 3 years ago, of a man with a pickaxe and gray eyes and no allies and no timber, deciding something with quiet, complete certainty in a field of rocky Colorado soil. She reached along the pew and took his hand in the candlelight, and he turned and looked at her with those gray eyes, warm and sure in the golden light, and she thought, "Here. This is the whole of it, the good, ordinary, extraordinary whole of it, After the service, as the congregation filed out into the snowy night, as the candles were extinguished one by one, and the church returned to its clean, silent self, Clara stayed in her pew. She stayed while the voices outside faded, while the last bootsteps crossed the pine floor and the door swung closed, until the only sound was the fire in the chimney and the faint soft weight of snow against the windows. She stayed until she was the last one in, just as she had been the first. She heard his footsteps on the floor, those steady, deliberate footsteps, and she smiled before she turned around. He sat down beside her, this man who had built this place with his hands and his stubbornness and his love for a mother long gone, and he sat with his big arms resting on his knees and his dark head tilted slightly toward hers, and they were quiet together in the church that had given them everything, this town, this life, each other, while the Colorado winter pressed softly against the walls and the last of the light died down to embers. "Last to leave," he said quietly. She turned and looked at him. "Always," she said. He smiled, the full, wide, unguarded one, the one like lightning, the one she had never stopped finding extraordinary. And she leaned her head against his shoulder, while outside the snow fell on the mountains and the valley and the small, warm light of Harrow Creek, which had been, against all reasonable expectation, exactly the right place for a mountain man to finally stop and build himself a life.